Farmers in China's Xinjiang province are turning a desert into a thriving farmland.
Millions of trees planted on sandy ground. Hundreds of square miles of desert turned into something that can be used for farming and more or less normal life. All this was done by China, a country that's taken transforming the uninhabitable into livable to the next level. With the help of nearly every citizen, China is getting rid of its harsh lands and will keep doing so for a long time to come. There's still lots of desert areas left, and simply planting trees doesn't always work, as desert conditions are just too tough. But then there's the Muus Desert, where the Chinese threw thousands of saplings into the sand without water. So what came of that? Let's find out. This is northern China, an area on the Ordos Plateau in the Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region. There used to be rivers and lakes here, along with tons of green spaces. Naturally, biodiversity was thriving, and then, well, humans did their thing. Years of farming, livestock raising, and deforestation, all that are the main reasons for desertification, which is exactly what happened in this area. By the middle of the last century, the Muus Desert, covering 16,300 square miles, turned into nothing but endless sand dunes and rocks. That was it. Nothing else was left. So growing crops and raising animals became impossible. Nature decided to hit back at human activity, so living near the Mu Desert was far from pleasant. Take Yulin for instance, one of the key cities in the desert area. The wind caused an unbelievable number of brutal sandstorms, forcing the city to move 3 times. The locals had to constantly deal with shifting dunes and sandy, freezing winters. Yep, that happened too, because a desert isn't always about heat. Sometimes deserts are just a freezing pile of sand where you can freeze to the bone in no time. When people needed to leave the house, they'd spend a long time breaking through thick crusts of sand piled up by the door after yet another sandstorm. Houses left exposed and never cleared could easily get buried under a thick layer of sand, turning into a full-on dune with a solid base. At the same time, the desert just kept growing. Local records from the city of Yulin show that over 100 years leading up to 1949, 540 square miles of fertile land were swallowed up by sand. The same fate hit 6 county-level towns and 412 villages and settlements. And the total area covered by forest and grassland in Yulin was just 1.8%, a great reason to move somewhere else. But there was a catch. In the middle of the last century, the people of China rose up against the landlord class, and that led to the birth of a socialist state. China went through the Great Famine. These days, experts say it was one of the biggest catastrophes in human history. At the start of 1962, 30% of the famine was blamed on natural disasters sent by nature, and the other 70% was down to human error. And there really were tons of those. Farming methods were changed radically, which made the whole system pretty ineffective. There was a campaign called the 4 Pests, where the authorities set out to wipe out 4 types of animals: rats, flies, mosquitoes, and sparrows. As we know, everything in nature is connected. So wiping out a large chunk of any of these creatures leads to disaster, and that's exactly what happened in China. For instance, with the sparrows gone, the locusts and other bugs multiplied fast and started ravaging the harvest. The country faced the inevitable consequences. In 1959, more than 600 million people in China were living in extreme poverty. That same year, the harvest dropped by 15% compared to 1958, and by 1960, it was only 70% of the 1958 level. According to Chinese government data, agricultural production fell from 200 million tons in 1958 to 170 million tons in 1959 and 143.5 million tons in 1960. Was there anywhere to flee from the cities? In the Muus Desert, China back then was one giant mess of famine, so, no. There was only one option left: to fight the desert, its barren lands, and its constant desire to take over more land suitable for farming. The battle with the Mu'us also began in the middle of the last century. It was part of the massive campaign by locals to combat the sand. The Chinese began burying seedlings in the sand, including trees and other plants. Some people sold their livestock to buy plants, and you can understand them. Why keep animals that won't survive in the desert anyway? One farmer, for example, sold 84 sheep, bought saplings, and started his long work of planting. Do you know what he achieved? He created a green belt 3.7 miles wide along the entire southern edge of the desert. And there were tons of examples like this. Absolutely everyone was interested in transforming the desert. Some families had been working on this for over 30 years. Several generations had been doing the same thing, all striving to make Mu suitable for farming and living. The trees they planted took root, brought water to the surface, and helped smaller plants and grasses grow. The more trees were planted, the higher the chances of survival for the next batch of plants. The government also supported the locals' efforts. It conducted a scientific study in the area, brought in water-retaining grasses and trees that encouraged broader vegetation recovery, and effectively dealt with the moving dunes. However, there was a problem, a low survival rate, because there's almost no moisture in the desert. Luckily, in 2004, one of the experts in the field of desertification control took on the job. He introduced a smart approach to planting trees, which allows the plants to survive with almost no watering. To put it briefly, it's a hydrodynamic treatment of the soil that helps maintain a balance between seedling growth and the soil's water supply potential. The result is ensuring moisture and reducing evaporation even in such tough conditions. What's the outcome of all this large-scale work? A real miracle. Let's start with this photo. On the left, you can see what it looked like in 1998. The grandson and grandfather planted the first poplar. On the right, there's a photo where both the grandson and the poplar have grown. It's 2020. A huge number of these poplars, along with other trees and smaller plants, have already grown. Since the start of the active planting campaign in Mu'us, about 40 million trees have been planted. There's, for example, Glon's larch, which was brought to Mu'us back in the last century. Scientists studied for a long time how this evergreen plant behaves in the desert, drew certain conclusions, and started planting it using dryland technology, which raised its survival rate to over 90%. At the moment, such larches have been planted in Mu'us on an area of more than 332 square miles. But larch isn't all that unusual. How about these species? This is the ecological base of Ai lavender in Yanwan. Although it's not set up right in the center of the desert, it's close to Mu'us. Where once there were drylands, this place is now incredibly beautiful, spread across 4,940 acres. The most striking feature is definitely the lavender, which paints the landscape purple. It occupies about 3,000 acres. Besides that, there are over 395 acres of other flowers like verbena, chrysanthemums, and a few other nurseries. The city of Yulon, which used to be badly affected by the Mu's desert sands, has also been transformed. For instance, the forest cover, which was less than 2% in the 1950s, reached 33% in 2020. People in nearby villages aren't planning to stop. So every year, their goal is to plant even more trees. In 2020, for instance, they aimed to plant saplings that would grow into trees in a few decades, covering another 988 acres. But this is just about locals. The government and private companies are also working to turn desert lands into forests. In the first quarter of 2020, for example, 41 government and private companies planted trees across more than 82,300 acres of desert in Yulon. Yes, they're really working on changing the situation in Yulon. But what about progress across the entire Mu Desert? Well, the results here are even more impressive. Check this out, on the left is a desert that hasn't been greened, and on the right is Mu, which we're discussing today. Back in the last century, the desert covered an area of about 16,300 square miles. Now, 93.24% of its land is mostly green. It's hard to even imagine that once nothing could grow here, and all there was around were just rocks and sand dunes. There's still quite a lot of work to do. As the director of the Shansha Provincial Forestry Bureau claims, around 74,000 acres of land remain desert-like, with shifting sand dunes and semi-fixed sandy areas. However, no one plans to stop for sure, because first of all, green areas are way better than deserts. And secondly, a desert turns from infertile land into fertile land, meaning agriculture can become possible.